Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Read by Ugo Agoruah. Chapter 2.5 Disorder in Consciousness, Psychic Entropy. One of the main forces that affects consciousness adversely is psychic disorder. That is, information that conflicts with existing intentions or distracts us from carrying them out. We give this condition many names, depending on how we experience it: pain, fear, rage, anxiety, or jealousy. All of these varieties of disorder force attention to be diverted to undesirable objects, leaving us no longer free to use it according to our preferences. Psychic energy becomes unwieldy and ineffective. Consciousness can become disordered in many ways. For instance, in a factory that produces audiovisual equipment, Julio Martinez, one of the people we studied in the experience sampling method, is feeling listless on his job. As the movie projectors pass in front of him on the assembly line, he is distracted and can hardly keep up the rhythm of moves necessary for soldering the connections that are his responsibility. Usually he can do his part of the job with time to spare and then relax for a while to exchange a few jokes before the next unit stops at his station. But today he is struggling, and occasionally he slows down the entire line. When the man at the next station kids him about it, Julio snaps back irritably. From morning to quitting time, tension keeps building, and it spills over to his relationships with his coworkers. Julio's problem is simple, almost trivial, but it has been weighing heavily on his mind. One evening a few days earlier, he noticed on arriving home from work that one of his tires was quite low. Next morning, the rim of the wheel was almost touching the ground. Julio would not receive his paycheck to the end of the following week, and he was certain he would not have enough money until then to have the tire patched up, let alone buy a new one. Credit was something he had not yet learned to use, and the factory was out in the suburbs, about 20 miles away from where he lived. He simply had to reach it by 8 a.m. The only solution Julio could think of was to drive gingerly to the service station in the morning, fill the tire with air, and then drive to work as quickly as possible. After work, the tire was low again, so he inflated it at a gas station near the factory and drove home. On the morning in question, he had been doing this for 3 days, hoping the procedure would work until the next paycheck. But today, by the time he made it to the factory, he could hardly steer the car because the wheel with the bum tire was so flat. All through the day he worried. Will I make it home tonight? How will I get to work tomorrow morning? These questions kept intruding his mind, disrupting concentration on his work, and throwing a pale on his moods. Julio is a good example of what happens when the internal order of self is disrupted. The basic pattern is always the same. Some information that conflicts with individuals' goals appears in consciousness. Depending on how central that goal is to the self, and on how severe the threat to it is, some amount of attention will have to be mobilized to eliminate the danger, leaving less attention free to deal with other matters. For Julio, holding a job was a goal of very high priority. If he were to lose it, all his other goals would be compromised. Therefore, keeping it was essential to maintaining the order of his self. The flat tire was jeopardizing his job, and consequently, it absorbed a great deal of his psychic energy. Whenever information disrupts consciousness by threatening its goals, we have a condition of inner disorder, or psychic entropy, a disorganization of the self that impairs its effectiveness. Prolonged experience of this kind can weaken the self to the point that it no longer is able to invest attention and pursue its goals. Julio's problem was relatively mild and transient. A more chronic example of psychic entropy is the case of Jim Harris, a greatly talented high school sophomore who was in one of our surveys. Alone at home on a Wednesday afternoon, he was standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom his parents used to share. On the box at his feet, a tape of the Grateful Dead was playing, as it had been almost without interruption for the past week. Jim was trying on one of his father's favorite garments, a heavy green chamois shirt his father had worn whenever the two had gone camping together. Passing his hand over the warm fabric, Jim remembered the cozy feeling of being snuggled up to his dad in the smoky tent, while the loons were laughing across the lake. In his right hand, Jim was holding a pair of large sewing scissors. The sleeves were too long for him, and he was wondering if he dared to trim them. Dad would be furious. Or would he even notice? A few hours later, Jim was lying in his bed. On the nightstand beside him was a bottle of aspirin, now empty, although there had been 70 tablets in it just a while before. Jim's parents had separated a year earlier, and now they were getting a divorce. During the week while he was in school, Jim lived with his mother. Friday evenings, he packed up to go and stay in his father's new apartment in the suburbs. One of the problems with this arrangement was that he was never able to be with his friends during the week. They were all too busy. And on weekends, Jim was stranded in a foreign territory where he knew nobody. He spent his free time on his phone, trying to make connections with his friends. Or he listened to tapes that he felt echoed the solitude gnawing inside him. But the worst thing, Jim felt, was that his parents were constantly battling for his loyalty. They kept making snide remarks about each other, trying to make Jim feel guilty if he showed any interest or love towards one in the presence of the other. "Help," he scribbled in his diary, a few days before his attempted suicide. "I don't want to hate my mom. I don't want to hate my dad. I wish they'd just stop doing this to me." Luckily, that evening, Jim's sister noticed the empty bottle of aspirin and called her mother, and Jim ended up in the hospital, where his stomach was pumped and he was set back on his feet in a few days. Thousands of kids his age are not that fortunate. The flat tire that threw Julio into a temporary panic and the divorce that almost killed Jim don't act directly as physical causes producing a physical effect. As for instance, one billiard ball hitting another and making it carome in a predictable direction. The outside event appears in consciousness purely as information, without necessarily having a positive or negative value attached to it. It is the self that interprets that raw information in the context of its own interest and determines whether it is harmful or not. For instance, if Julio had had more money or some credit, his problem would have been perfectly innocuous. If in the past he had invested more psychic energy in making friends on the job, the flat tire would not have created panic, because he could have always asked one of his coworkers to give him a ride for a few days. And if he had had a stronger sense of self-confidence, the temporary setback would not have affected him as much, because he would have trusted his ability to overcome it eventually. Similarly, if Jim had been more independent, the divorce would not have affected him as deeply. But at his age, his goals must still be bound up too closely with those of his mother and father, so that the split between them also split his sense of self. Had he had closer friends, or a longer record of goals successfully achieved, his self would have had the strength to maintain its integrity. He was lucky that after the breakdown, his parents realized the predicament and sought help for themselves and their son, reestablishing a stable enough relationship with Jim to allow him to go on with the task of building a sturdy self. Every piece of information we process gets evaluated for its bearing on the self. Does it threaten our goals? Does it support them? Or is it neutral? News of the fall of the stock market will upset the banker, but it might reinforce the sense of self of the political activist. A new piece of information will either create disorder in consciousness by getting us all worked up to face the threat, or it will reinforce our goals, thereby freeing up psychic energy.